Obviously, not great news earlier today, but before we start things with games still going on as we speak, what are your thoughts on how this season is going to play out?
It's all so unpredictable, Aiden. I don't think anybody really knows. When they announced the agreement to play, I think I, like a lot of other people, figured it was maybe 50-50 as to whether we'd actually get to opening day. But then when teams started coming to their camps and they trained for 3 weeks, and there really were very few positive cases, it was very encouraging. The next question was, of course, what would happen when teams started traveling, staying in hotels, dealing with people on airplanes, buses, in the hotels, food delivery people, and all that. And when that when that started, it didn't take long for a team to have an outbreak. So now, who knows?
What has the start of the season just in general been like for you? Obviously, this is a little bit crazy, I think, from all the videos that I've seen on Twitter from all these guys that are starting their seasons, especially the guys that are away that are starting the seasons in Baltimore doing games from Oriole Stadium when there's no game. Like, I know you haven't really experienced that yet because they haven't gone on the road, but still, it's been very weird nonetheless.
It's extremely weird. It's even stranger for us, I think, because we're working in a new stadium we've never been in before. We don't know what Globe Life Field is like with fans in it. We haven't seen it. We don't really know what the atmosphere is like. We don't know how loud it's going to be. Anytime you work out of a new stadium, it's weird just trying to read the ball off the bat and get used to the nuances of where you're working. And you add to that the fact that there are no fans, and it seems even stranger. Maybe the weirdest thing of all is that we don't have any access to the players or to the manager other than the regularly scheduled Zoom calls that the teams are doing. I can't just wander into the clubhouse, and ask Rugnet Odor, hey, what happened on that play last night? Or ask the Ranger third base coach, how'd you see that play? Why'd you wave him in, or why'd you stop him? Or ask somebody, did you think that ball was gone when you hit it? I don't get to ask any of those questions, and that's a really important part of our broadcast. The one thing that we have normally that fans don't have is access to the players to ask those questions. All of the biographical stuff, all of the statistical stuff, people can find online if they want to do the same research that I do, but they can't go and talk to the players about what happened last night, or what was it like last time you faced this pitcher who you're going to face this evening. That's been really strange. The most encouraging thing to me, though, Aiden, has been that in my ears, anyway, it sounds normal. The guy who's running the crowd noise simulator, at least in our ballpark, is very, very good. And the crowd noise, to me, has sounded extremely authentic, which is good because I thought it might be very distracting if it didn't.
Yeah, I think that is kind of one of the brighter spots of this, is that the crowd noise the other day on Fox and with ESPN, I think Fox did a really good job of not just one bass track for the whole game, but like being able to really emphasize the emotions of the fans. I think that's been something that's obviously important. Fans are not just chatting the same way throughout the game. The crowd gets up with the team and down with the team. And I think that was one of the more interesting things. But you actually beat me to my next question, which is about the players. I think a lot of what you do on the radio and what the team broadcasters do when you're broadcasting to a specific fan base is a lot of what they're adding in between pitches is anecdotal stuff that they get from the manager or from the players, like Corey Kluber in between a game. And it's kind of been difficult. How have you, I don't know about made up for it, but how have you been able to get those little nuggets without being able to, like you said, walk into a clubhouse and talk to a player?
All I can do really is listen in on every Zoom conference that the Rangers schedule, and as many as possible that the opposing team schedules. One of the things we emphasized when we realized we wouldn't have access to the players, and we also wouldn't be seeing the other team's broadcasters because none of us are traveling, is that we get access to the other team's Zoom conferences too, and also get access to all of the press clippings that are written about them every day. In the first series anyway, we got all that information. I was able to read everything that was written from the Rockies standpoint when we were playing them all weekend. I could listen in on manager Bud Black's press conference, whatever 2 or 3 players they made available each day. And that's about the best we can do in coming up with that information. As far as the kind of stuff that I normally get from the other team's broadcasters, which is always the best scouting material on their team, we're doing it by phone and by email. I made sure I had a long conversation the day before the series started with Jack Corrigan, the Rockies radio guy. I'll hopefully do the same thing with Greg Schulte, the Diamondbacks announcer, before we start playing them tomorrow. And even sending them kind of a little scouting report via email to save a little bit of time.
So has the team notes that you usually get handed, obviously when you're playing the Diamondbacks, you're probably already got a nice big pack of notes on what they have. Has that become more important than usual for you?
Yeah, it is. I don't usually use the notes that much, but now in the absence of information I can go get personally, I am using the press notes more. And so it becomes more and more important that the press notes be done well and actually supply information that I find to be interesting enough to use on the air. And there's a very big difference in the quality of notes from team to team. The Diamondbacks are one of the very best. So I'm looking forward to these next couple of days and see the kind of nuggets that their PR people supply to us.
Has your booth setup changed? I know it kind of depends on booth to booth. Everybody that is on the road is doing games remotely, but I know some broadcasters are choosing to use multiple booths and not have anybody in the same booth. What has your booth setup been like, and do you enjoy it? Is it better than usual? What has that experience been like for you?
Well, in our new ballpark, the booth is very wide. It's 15 feet wide. So my partner and I, Matt Hicks and I, are 8 or 9 feet away from each other in our normal spots to do the game. So we do not have a plexiglass divider between us, as some announcers are doing, and some are using separate booths entirely. We look back and forth at each other a lot, to take our cues from each other on when to talk, when not to talk. So I thought it was important that we, if possible, be in the same booth without a plexiglass between us. And it's working out just fine. The problem for us is that in this new stadium, the booth is extremely high up. This is the trend in a lot of the new stadiums where they want to sell all the good locations for luxury boxes. They move the broadcasters and the writers high up. And it takes a while to get used to reading the ball from up there. It's a lot harder than it was in our old stadium. It's just going to take some time.
What is better about having a broadcaster in the booth with you rather than being in 2 separate booths?
Well, I guess it's different for every broadcast team, but for us, we do a 2-man broadcast pretty much all the time. And we're talking back and forth. We goof around a lot and talk about things that aren't necessarily related to the game. And being able to make eye contact and see the other announcer clearly when he's doing play-by-play, to have a feel for when he's completed his thought and is definitely taking a pause. You see that as much as you hear that. And for us, that's really important. For some other broadcast teams, it's not that important. They tend to work more solo. They don't talk back and forth as much. And I think of the guys who are doing the games from their houses. Charlie Steiner in Los Angeles with the Dodgers, Denny Matthews in Kansas City, how hard that must be for them, to be comfortable with their partners as to who's going to talk when. Denny pretty much works by himself, so it's not that much of an issue. But with Charlie, it's a little bit different. Charlie and Rick Mundy and Nomar Garcia-Parra, guys who work with him, they're going to have to get used to the fact that they can't look at each other.
Well, fortunately for you, that's really not something you need to worry about, at least for now. Before we get into your career, what are your thoughts? I know you've talked a little bit about getting moved higher up. What are your thoughts of this new Rangers ballpark and the layout? It's brand new. Would have been really nice to unveil it with some fans, but that'll have to wait. What are your first impressions of having used this for a series?
I love the ballpark. I was in it a few times while they were building it, and the thing that struck me was how steep it is. Built more along the lines of an arena than a baseball park, where the incline of the stands, especially the first two decks, is much steeper than in most ballparks, making the seats closer to the field. Even though they might be a little bit higher up, they're closer to the field and they have a much better viewing angle. I think the park, when it has fans in it, is going to be really loud. It has an intimate feel to it, with 40,000 seats, but the decks stacked one on top of another. It's more of an intense feeling. I like it a lot. I love the artificial turf. It's playing and looking just like grass. And most of all, I love the fact that this appears to be a pitcher's park. After playing for 26 years in a launching pad where there are cheap home runs every single night, balls that come off the bat, off the trademark, that get caught in the wind and go for home runs. It's wonderful to be in a place where you really have to hit the ball to get a home run. We played 3 games over the weekend. There was a total of 3 home runs, and there were probably 4 or 5 other balls where we thought, that's a home run across the street in our old ballpark. So I love the fact we're more likely to see low-scoring games. We're less likely to see teams just trying to hit a home run every pitch, which has been one of the trends in baseball that I don't care for. I think we'll see more of the small ball because it is harder to hit the ball out of the park. And I think all of that's going to make for some really interesting baseball.
It's probably going to be a fun little ballpark to play a playoff game in, yeah?
For sure. It's going to be amazingly loud, even when the roof is open. And, we haven't experienced that yet. But certainly when the roof is closed, I think it will be deafening.
All right. So we talked a little bit about how things are going to go now that baseball has returned. Let's talk a little bit about your career. Tell me, I always like to start the guests off with, when did you first get into broadcasting and what got you into broadcasting?
Well, I grew up in Brooklyn, New York. And, I went to Brooklyn Dodger games when I was 5 and 6, and then the team moved. And all of a sudden, all we had was the Yankees, and we didn't particularly like the Yankees, but they were all we had, and they were awfully good. So I listened religiously to their games on the radio. And my dad was a dentist, and he was a big baseball fan, and we would listen to the games in the car. And we were driving in the car one day. It was an afternoon. He had picked me up on his lunch hour, and the Yankees were playing an afternoon game. And I asked him, it dawned on me, hey, Mel Allen and Red Barber, these guys who are broadcasting the Yankee games, how did they get off work today to be able to go to Yankee Stadium and call this game? And he said, no, that is their work. I said, you mean you're going to go back to the office in an hour and you're going to fill cavities and you're going to pull teeth, and they go to Yankee Stadium and watch a baseball game? He said, yep. I said, Dad, they've got a better job than you do. That's what I'm going to do. I was maybe 7 years old. And that's really what I wanted to do from that point on. And I would drive people crazy. I'd turn down the sound on TV and make believe I was broadcasting the game. And they got me a little tape recorder when I was about 12, I think. And I would do make-believe broadcasts. And I'd go to games and sit in the upper deck by myself and do make-believe broadcasts. And so I wanted to do it from a really early age, basically from the time I found out that it's an actual paying job.
I know you said that you always wanted to kind of to own a deli. That it was basically between deli and broadcasting. At what point did deli become out of the picture?
I think once I realized that broadcasting was actually a possibility, the deli fallback kind of fell by the wayside. When I was in high school, I got a chance to go to a program at Northwestern University during the summer after my junior year for kids interested in radio and TV. And they basically taught us how to be a disc jockey, how to do a newscast, how to use our voices, how to start getting rid of our regional accents. There were kids from all around the country. There were guys talking like this from the South, and then there were guys like me talking like they were from Brooklyn and doing sportscasting. And they taught me, the words that I needed to clean up if I was going to get a job somewhere other than Brooklyn someday. We also got our FCC licenses, which was very important because you couldn't work as a disc jockey back then without an FCC license. And the following summer, one of the kids in that program actually got me a job at his hometown radio station filling in for the disc jockeys when they took their summer vacation breaks in Hope, Arkansas. And that was actually my first paid job, a country and western disc jockey in Hope, Arkansas. And then I went on to college the following year at Brown University, and I already had professional radio experience. So when I went up to the radio station and I told them, I wanted to do everything I can possibly do, but mostly I wanted to do play-by-play, they put me on the hockey and football play-by-play crew. And eventually, over a couple of years, I worked my way up from the pregame guy and the stat guy to the color guy to eventually, when the play-by-play guy graduated, I became the play-by-play guy. And, I did hockey play-by-play for my junior and senior years and was good enough when I graduated that I got a job doing minor league hockey in Muskegon, Michigan. And that's how the whole thing really got started for me.
It's interesting that you told me about the regional accents, because I know, having interviewed Brian Anderson, he told me he hated his voice. He had this big Texas drawl. How do you, and I know he had a book that he read that kind of helped him get rid of it. How did you get rid of yours?
I took voice and diction freshman year in college. And the professor, who was a drama professor, he was very good. He actually made a list of words for me that I was butchering. And I would go home every night and I would stand in front of the mirror, make sure I pronounced the R in car, didn't say caw. The two R's, the hardest word for a broadcaster from Brooklyn. Corner. We say corner. In Brooklyn, we say corner. I'm going down to the corner. Corner. Over and over and over again. Ball, not ball. Dog, not dog. And it's just a matter of saying it over and over and mimicking people who speak properly. And when I graduated from Brown and I got this first job in Muskegon, Michigan, the people there had, Midwestern speech, which is extremely non-regional. And I basically just imitated everybody. I just tried to talk like a Michigander. And by the time I was done with 3 years there, I think I had pretty much lost, all traces of the Brooklyn accent.
So obviously the accent is something that can be a little distracting on air. And I think we would all agree most people would rather not hear a heavy accent. But if you're talking about doing Dodgers games, obviously you didn't really get a chance to do a ton of games in the New York market, but for somebody who was, I'm trying to think, I can't think of anybody who really did this, but could that accent, like if you're doing a game in Boston, do you think that local listeners, since that would be your main market, would actually rather hear somebody that sounds like a Bostoner, like a Red Sox fan on their games?
I'm not sure because you never really hear it. The New York guys, the Mets guys, Howie Rose and Wayne Randazzo, they're from there. They don't have New York accents. John Sterling's from Manhattan. He doesn't have a New York accent. Now, Susan Waldman, the Yankees, color analyst, has an accent, but she actually has kind of a Boston accent. I think as an analyst, it doesn't matter that much. But as the play-by-play guy, you really want to sound non-regional, no matter where it is you're working. I know in the old days in the Texas League, you'd hear announcers who would sound very Texan. But at the major league level, no, I haven't heard it.
That's interesting. Just kind of a thought that popped into my head, like, would a local guy rather hear a New York guy? But, that's fair. So we talk about your career, and you did all this stuff at a very young age, and then you go to college at Brown. What went into that decision? And knowing that you wanted to be a broadcaster, did you have doubts that you didn't go to a broadcasting school?
That was a highly debated issue, and that's a really good question. I asked for advice from a number of professional broadcasters, and the best piece of advice I got was from a guy named Bill Mazer, who was the first sports talk show host in New York. And Bill was kind enough to write me a letter and tell me that he thought it was a good idea to not go to a school like Syracuse, for example, with a big broadcast department where I wouldn't get enough time on the air. He thought it was more important to go to a school that had a really good radio station and you could learn from the other students how to do it. but then get a lot of airtime, especially if you wanted to be a play-by-play announcer. And Brown had a very highly regarded radio station. They had produced a number of disc jockeys and newscasters, and it seemed to me to be a good choice. It was also about the right size. I didn't want to go to one of these large state universities or bigger school. It had about 5,000 students. It was a comfortable driving distance from New York. It was 3.5 hours from my house. Everything about it seemed to be perfect. And it was great advice. The students ahead of me at Brown, the ones who taught me how to be a play-by-play announcer and how to be a better newscaster and all the other things I did on the air, were extremely talented and extremely knowledgeable. It's been a pipeline that has produced a lot of national announcers. CNN has had 3 or 4 major people from Brown. Chris Berman followed me at Brown. And it turned out for me to be an excellent decision. And I got lots of play-by-play time that I might not have had, at some other university where there might have been guys better than me, or for whatever reason, due to the politics of it all, I've gotten the opportunity to do it, more than I did. Play-by-play in particular is a skill you only learn by doing. There are phrases that you need in order to do play-by-play of any sport. Once you come up with the phrases, you compile a list of phrases, or however it is you learn to command the phrases, you just have to do it. And that helps you develop your on-air style. Sitting in a classroom and learning the theory of how to do it can only take you so far. And since I wasn't interested in the other aspects of broadcasting that you would learn at a school with a big broadcasting department, and at that time, the one I was looking at was Stanford, which was one of the only ones that had communications and broadcasting back in the late 60s. You're better off just concentrating on the extracurricular aspect of the radio. Take a lot of English so that your command of the language becomes better. If they have journalism, take it. We didn't have it. If they have writing courses, take that, since most entry-level jobs, make you also write press releases. And, we didn't have sales, or I would have taken sales. I recommend to guys now, learn how to sell, because selling advertising is often the way you actually make your money in the minor leagues as an announcer. You don't make your money doing the games. You make your money selling fence signs or program ads, or ticket packages. Learn how to sell. That's really important. But for me, actually doing play-by-play and learning by doing it was much more important than sitting in some classroom and learning about how to do TV production or radio production or the theory of broadcasting or anything like that.
Yeah, I would agree. I think broadcasting is kind of one of those things where you just have to do it. You can't sit in a classroom. Like, I know you wanted to be a lawyer, and you took some steps during that when you thought your career was kind of over. It can't be like, you can't sit in a classroom and read broadcasting textbooks and then come out and become a good broadcaster. It's not a test you can study for. It's a real life thing that you have to be able to perform when you're on the air. And I think it's one of those things where you really have to do it in real life in order to learn it. But speaking of learning, obviously you were at Brown, and that is not exactly the first school that would come to mind as a communications school. Who did you go to when you needed advice, both in the business and in the school, when you needed advice, given that there weren't a ton of people like you that wanted to do what you did at the school?
Yeah, in the 2 sports that I did, football and hockey, the upperclassmen ahead of me basically became my mentor. A guy named Chip Babcock was the football announcer. And as it turns out, he's still a very good friend of mine. He's my attorney, and he's actually one of the top broadcast attorneys in the country. He represents Oprah and Dr. Phil, among others. But he was and remains, a great advisor for me. And the guy who did hockey, a guy named Jim Shantz, was the guy who I ultimately went to for advice when I started my hockey broadcasting career. He was one of the best hockey announcers I ever heard. He had an incredible voice, but he was also a very talented computer engineer. And when he graduated from Brown, he was offered such great jobs in computer engineering that he basically bypassed uh, a broadcasting career. He didn't want to go to a place like Muskegon, Michigan, and work for $7,000 a year, which is what I got paid in my first job. When he had a fantastic job handed to him, I believe at the time by Polaroid, to be a computer engineer for them. But those were the two guys really who helped me the most and who gave me a lot of great advice on how to do it.
So you went to Brown, and then you graduate and you start entering the market. Most of your entry-level jobs are exactly what a lot of people would picture an entry-level broadcast position in. Oklahoma City, like the lower-level markets. How did you feel about entering into those markets? I know a lot of guys feel a little uncomfortable because obviously it's not the most financially payable job. You're not getting paid a ton. How did you feel entering into the industry and working in those lower level markets?
I loved it, Aiden. I didn't care where I was working. I just wanted to get a chance to do games. And $7,000 was fine for me, in 1972 as a single guy. I lived just fine on $140 a week. Living in Muskegon, Michigan, it was fun 3 or 4 months a year. The other 8 months, it was really cold, and I really didn't care for it that much. But living in a small town, I thought it was interesting. It was a different experience for me. People were very friendly. I made some really good friends there who are lifelong friends. But after 3 years there, I really thought that if I couldn't get to a bigger market, then I probably wasn't that good, and maybe should think about going back to school, going to law school. As it turned out, I got a job in Oklahoma City that kept me in the business. And for me, that was like going to Hollywood. I mean, it was going from a town of like 40,000 to a town of 500,000 or 600,000, and a AAA job within the hockey world at that time, so that the people who would come down to watch the games there were NHL general managers, and really top level scouts. Even former players who I had idolized. Bobby Orr came and sat next to me one game, and Rod Gilbert, who had been my favorite player growing up with the Rangers, was working in the Ranger front office. Then he came down, he sat next to me one game. That was really thrilling. So for me, living in Oklahoma City was really fun. And as a mid-sized city, I thought it was a very comfortable place to live. And I would have been okay, had it worked out that way, staying there for the rest of my life. I think I would have been fine. But, as luck would have it, the Oklahoma City team moved to Dallas after I was there 1 year and took me with them. And so all of a sudden I was in a major market, but doing a minor league sport. And that was a little bit odd because nobody cared about minor league hockey in Dallas, Texas at the time. But they had a team and they had games to do, and they had a radio station and they paid me to do it. And once I moved to Dallas, I just loved living here, and I'm still here.
So you talked about how the NHL hockey scouts would come, and the closest thing I could think of that is the Cape Cod Baseball League, where you've got professional experience and all the broadcasters that go there. Obviously, that's the top place to spend a summer if you're looking to get into baseball. Were you actively looking for these scouts to try and get them tapes and try to move up to the NHL level at that point? Or was it kind of just very cool that they were there, but you didn't really think much of it?
Yeah, it was cool that they were there. It was kind of the early stages of networking back then, just to be able to drop a name, if you applied for a job, which I never got anyway. I never got an NHL job, but at least I could say, ask Rod Gilbert what he thought of my broadcast, or ask Bobby Orr what he thought of my broadcast, or the couple of general managers who sat next to me. That in itself was just kind of, it was encouraging, that a game would be over and they said, hey, you did a really good job. I think you could be an NHL announcer someday. That helped keep me going, that's for sure.
Did you have doubts? I know you definitely had doubts in Michigan, but did you have doubts at any point after that this was maybe the wrong career for you and you should try something else?
I did, largely because I didn't have a great voice. My voice didn't really deepen until I was in my early 30s. So I sounded young. And, you don't get a National Hockey League job, sounding like a kid, sounding young. You know, it's one of the unfortunate things about this business is that if you don't have the voice that the decision maker likes, you're not going to get hired, even if your play by play is brilliant and everything you say is clever and informative and entertaining. They're not going to listen to your tape for more than 15 seconds if they don't think you have a good voice. And so I had my doubts that I'd ever get a big league job because I didn't think I had a good enough voice. I was lucky enough that when I was in Dallas and doing minor league hockey there, the guy who was in charge of broadcasting for the Texas Rangers really liked my hockey broadcasts, and he didn't mind my voice. I guess that's the best way to put it. He didn't love it, but he didn't mind it. And when they were looking to hire a young announcer to replace a guy who was going to retire in a year or two, he was willing basically to train me and let me learn on the job and kind of hope that my voice would mellow out, and it actually did in a couple of years.
What do you have to say to the kids that don't think they can get into the industry because of their voice? Do you think the stigma around having a voice for radio is kind of over, or do you think it's still kind of there in the industry?
No, it's very much there, and they need to realize that. It's not impossible, but it's definitely harder if you don't have a really good voice to get that job. And the thing you don't know is when or if your voice is going to change. And, there are guys doing Major League Baseball who don't have the classic voices. The classic probably is Joe Castiglione, the Red Sox announcer, who's been there for, 30 some odd years and, is an icon in New England, as he should be. He doesn't have what you would consider a classic broadcast voice, but he's so good at what he does. He got that first job, and once you get that first job, they realize you're really good. But it would have been easier for him if he had a different voice to get that first job. So people need to realize that that is something they're going to be judged on, and it's very possible that their career is going to go nowhere just because people don't care for their voice. It's definitely reality.
Is it true that you got a hockey job over Mike Emmerich when you were working in the minor leagues?
Yeah, when I was in Muskegon, thinking of going back to law school, Mike was broadcasting for Port Huron in the same league. It was called the International Hockey League. And, we were good buddies, and as we all were in that league, and we were all applying for every job that came open in a higher league. So we both applied for this job in Oklahoma City, and we were the two finalists for the job. And the general manager of the Oklahoma City Blazers, who was also the coach, was a guy named Ray Miron. And he would travel with the team, and the person he would hang out with on the road was the broadcaster. He couldn't hang out with the players. He would hang out with the broadcaster. So before he made his decision on who to hire, he had us both fly to Montreal, where hockey has their annual convention in June. And he had dinner with me one night, and he had dinner with Mike the next night. And Ray enjoyed more than just a cocktail or two. And I stayed with him, and we had a really good time. And Mike doesn't drink very much. And I don't know what happened when he went to dinner with Ray, but my guess is they didn't have as much fun as Ray and I did. And I didn't know who the other finalist was. But after Ray had dinner with Mike, he called me. It was probably about midnight. I was in my hotel room in Montreal. And he said, "Hey, Eric, it's Ray. I just want to tell you got the job." I said, "Oh, thanks. That's great." He says, I've got this problem. I said, "What's that?" He says, "Well, the other guy's really good, and I don't know how to tell Mike Emmerich that he didn't get the job." And, I knew Mike was really good. I didn't realize he was going to become the Vin Scully of hockey, the greatest announcer ever, which in my mind he is. And he's still a really good friend of mine. But I tell people I got a hockey job over Mike Emmerich because I was a better drinker. And that's probably the truth. That's probably why I got hired, because I would be more fun as a wingman to the guy who hired us than Mike would have been.
How important is the off-air stuff when you're applying for a job? Obviously, you and Mike probably had the same reel. Nothing much different. It probably was not, you could tell that you were better or you could tell he was better. It was probably the same reel. I would assume from what you're saying that it was mostly just that one night that kind of decided how your career would take off. How important is it to be able to kind of interact with people off the air?
Well, it's important, in any business to make a good impression, in an interview setting or, however you meet your potential bosses. I think it's more important, though, in getting those early jobs to show them what else you can do for the organization, whether it's a team or a radio station. If you can show them you can bring in money, either through sales, that's the obvious way, selling advertising, or through your proficiency at social media. I know if you talk to Aaron Goldsmith, the Seattle announcer, who got their job over hundreds of applicants, he'll tell you it was largely because of how good he was at social media and how he showed them what he could do for them in addition to broadcasting the games, even while he was broadcasting a game, how he could connect with fans, how he could build the audience with social media, how he could help the team's PR department. And so I think I tell people all the time, you need to do that. That's probably much more important now than, the connection you might make in a personal interview with somebody. My situation with Oklahoma City was very rare, where the guy who hired you was actually going to be traveling with you, and wants a buddy. But the ability to help the organization in other ways is still there. Another thing that's really important now is in baseball is the ability to speak Spanish. If you're up for a job and everything else is equal and you speak Spanish and the other guy doesn't, you're going to get the job. And so that's one of the bits of advice I give to every aspiring baseball announcer. When you get an opportunity to take language, choose Spanish. I didn't. When I was in high school, I took French because they told me it would help me get into a better college. I wish I'd taken Spanish. But as it turned out, I started learning Spanish when I was 40 years old, and we started getting all of these players from Puerto Rico and Venezuela who didn't speak English. And, it was one of the best decisions I ever made. I wish I had made it, 25 years earlier. But it's really important within baseball now to be able to speak Spanish.
Yeah, I read about that, that you learned how to speak Spanish when Ruben Sierra got signed with the Rangers. The importance of that, but just the importance of being able to connect with players, kind of changing, like adapting to the trends in Major League Baseball. Major League Baseball has now become overly Hispanic. It's become extremely filled with these Cuban and Venezuelan and great players from Latin and Central America. How does that connection kind of help you as opposed to another broadcaster? And how did that benefit you just as a broadcaster and as a person?
Well, I think I get more information from the Latin American players because I've been to their countries. I speak their language. I have visited every country that plays baseball. I've been to a lot of their hometowns. They tend to trust me more. When they get to the big leagues and they're all nervous and they don't speak much English and they're worried about making a mistake or they need a translator, and I can walk up to them and start speaking Spanish and have them speak Spanish back, they relax, they trust me. So I'm able to get information from them that maybe other broadcasters wouldn't get. And when we need a guy on a post-game show who doesn't speak English very well, we don't have to wait for the translator. I'll translate. I'll ask him the questions in Spanish. Sometimes he'll answer in English then, which, however, he's more comfortable. It doesn't prevent us from, interviewing a guy, which it would, if I didn't speak Spanish. As a person, I think it's broadened my worldview tremendously to be able to speak the language, and go to Cuba several times and actually see what that communist society is like. See how people live in the Dominican. Go to San Pedro de Macorís, where so many of these players are from, where they grow up literally dirt poor. Um, all of that, I think, makes you a more open-minded, more aware person. Anytime you travel, I think it does that. But particularly if you can travel and speak the language in the country you're visiting, I think it really does broaden your horizons.
Yeah, my family went on vacation in the Dominican Republic a few years ago, and we took a bus from the airport to the resort. And it was so weird. We were walking past a guy who was cutting hair on the side of the road, just a roadside barber. And like he literally had a chair set up on the side of the road, and then we turned into the resort. Like, it's so crazy how you can go from kind of third world looking country to beautiful resort and beaches. And I think getting to go down there, I don't know how much you go down there, but you've certainly been down there a few times. It's crazy how many of these players have come out of poverty and been able to overcome the odds and make it in the league.
Yeah, and the fact that I can appreciate that means a lot to these guys. And when you do go to a country like that, if you don't speak the language, you're going to just stay at the resort, where you're safe. If you speak the language, you're more likely to travel around. I go to these countries and I go wherever I want. And I know that I can fend for myself. And, that's a tremendous advantage. So again, I can't urge strongly enough that anybody who wants to have any job in baseball, whether or not you're a broadcaster, if you're a PR guy or you're a marketing guy, whatever it is you want to do, it's going to make you more valuable to your organization if you can speak Spanish.
So obviously we got through the hockey part of your career. I feel like there's kind of three different parts: the beginning of your career as a child, and then becoming the hockey guy, going through the minor leagues, and now obviously what you are now, the radio voice of the Rangers in the major leagues. How did that job come about, and what was the process like getting hired for them, having not done baseball at any capacity?
Yeah, I was really lucky. It was really right place, right time. The Rangers in 1978 were an organization that didn't have a lot of money, and they had never won anything. They were a competitive team, but not a great team. Their attendance was so-so, not horrible, but not great. And the guy running the broadcast department wanted to hire somebody young to replace an announcer who had announced his intention to retire in a year or two. And they wanted, ideally, somebody who they could vet very easily, which they could do because I was in town and they could speak to people who knew me. I had met some of the people in their organization at various events. And they were looking somebody they didn't have to pay very much. And since I was making very little doing minor league hockey, that was certainly not an issue. But the problem was, when they called me and asked me if I had ever done baseball, and I lied and told them I had, I didn't have a tape. But they let me come out and do 4 games into a tape recorder. They gave me my own booth. They gave me some stats and said, go get them, kid. And I did 4 games into a tape recorder. And they listened to the first couple of innings of the first game and the last couple of innings of the last game. And they decided that I had made enough progress that given a whole off season to get ready, I could get to the point where I wouldn't embarrass myself or them. But still, why would they hire me and not somebody who had done minor league baseball somewhere? Well, the answer is they were also looking to hire a sales guy. They had 2 jobs open. And I told them that if they hired me to do the broadcasts, I would do the sales job too, which is something that major league announcers didn't generally do even then and never do now. But I figured the only way I'm going to get this job is if I can show them that there's a reason to hire me over some minor league guy who knows what he's doing. And I was a decent sales guy selling advertising for the hockey team. And that's why I got the job. I was local, so they didn't have to pay moving expenses. And I could be very well vetted. I could do personal interviews easily with everybody in the organization. And most important, I was willing to go out and sell and bring in some money. And I did that until 1984, I think. So my first 5 years there, the day after the season ended, I was at my desk, you know, calling up people trying to sell sponsorships for the next season.
So was that an off-season thing, or did you do that in continuance in while you were doing that during the season?
I did it during the season too. I mean, most of the sales is done in the off season, but not all of it. And you do have to service your clients. You stay in touch with your clients during the season. So I would go into the office, during the season. I would usually go into the office about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, spend a couple of hours in the office before going over to the ballpark and start getting ready to do the game. And I didn't mind it because that's what I had been used to. That was normal for me. Um, Eventually, when I didn't have to do it anymore, I felt like, I was on vacation. What? Just show up to do the game? This is incredible. It took a few years before I earned the right to do that, but eventually it happened, and everything seemed so much easier then.
I know you succeeded John Miller, right? He was the one that had the job right before you.
No, I worked with him for 1 year. The guy who
Oh,
had the
okay.
job before me was a guy named Bill Merrill, and he worked with John Miller. John had done the Oakland A's games and had been fired by Charlie Finley for no good reason, of course, and was actually out of baseball. He was doing professional soccer when the Rangers had an announcer named Dick Reisenhoover, who was diagnosed with cancer during the off season and actually died the night before opening day in 1978. And John got hired to replace Dick Reisenhoover and got a 2-year contract. So in 1978, I listened to John every day. And then when I got hired in August that year, I sat with John the whole last month of the season, and Bill Merrill, this guy who was going to retire in a while. The following year, we all worked together. Bill decided he wanted to work one more year. So Bill worked with John and me, and which was great because, John more than anybody taught me how to do baseball. After just doing hockey and hearing a lot of baseball games my whole life, but not doing it, John taught me so much about the pacing, how to slow down after doing hockey, how to be conversational and use your personality, which you didn't have to do in hockey. All that stuff I learned from him. And, we worked together that 1 year in 1979. And then John had a chance to go to Boston. And the Rangers, they let him go. And John went off to do the Red Sox. And the Rangers hired a guy named Mel Proctor. They didn't think I was ready to be the lead announcer, and they were certainly right. I don't know if I was even ready to be the second announcer. But they hired Mel Proctor, and for 2 years I worked with Mel before they hired a guy named Mark Holtz, who was doing the Dallas Mavericks at the time. And then Holtzy and I worked together for 13 years, and that was the best thing that ever happened to me because the chemistry with him was instant, and we became really popular then as a radio team.
What did you learn from John Miller? I know you said he taught you a lot about how to do baseball on the radio. What were some specific things that he kind of helped you learn, or just whether he knew it or not, you learned from him?
I think it was to trust your personality and trust your sense of humor. Um, you know, Back then, most baseball announcers were still pretty stiff and formal. There wasn't a whole lot of kidding around. And John was always, John always kind of had a "this is not brain surgery" approach to the whole thing. Let's have fun. So from John, I basically learned that to use your personality on the air. I also learned how to dress for radio. John would show up in shorts and Hawaiian shirts when it was 100 degrees at our ballpark, and I learned that you don't have to show up and be formal to do a baseball game on the radio.
Yeah, I think that was actually a conversation I was having the other day with a friend of mine who's a broadcaster about. There was an article that came out today about how Len Casper and forgot his partner, but with the Chicago Cubs, they were wearing suits because the marquee network wanted them to wear suits, and it was like 100-degree heat. Obviously, that's much different in radio, but anyways, you get into the booth. It's your first game on the radio in Texas. I'm sure you had to be freaking out, right? I know obviously you did a lot of off-season prep, but this was your first really Major League Baseball game, and you had never done baseball really before.
Yeah, my first game, as it turned out, was in Detroit at the old Tiger Stadium. It was a really cold afternoon, and we were working in an outdoor press box. And I remember just shivering all afternoon. And I was so nervous, and we were doing radio and TV then. Back then, the announcers would cross over during the game. So I was actually doing the beginning of the game and the end of the game on TV with a guy named Frank Gleber, who was our TV announcer. The middle innings, I would go over to radio, and John Miller would go over to TV. Um, but anyway, when the game was over, I was going to go down on the field and interview the star of the game. And I, before I went down there, I went to the bathroom, and I was so nervous that I was tugging on the zipper of my fly, and I ripped it completely. So my pants were wide open, and I had a sport jacket on, but I didn't have an overcoat. So I went running back into our booth during the commercial, and I said, "Frank, I got to borrow your overcoat." And Frank was about 10 sizes larger than I was. So he had this white trench coat that I put on, and that's what I wore down on the field for my first major league TV interview. Rangers won the game. Ferguson Jenkins pitched the complete game. I went down on the field, interviewed Ferguson Jenkins wearing this giant white trench coat. And I'll never forget how relieved I was when that whole thing was over.
Obviously, you were relieved at the end, but how did you feel during the game? Did it take a little bit to break in, or were you kind of just comfortable from the start?
No, I was really nervous, because I hadn't done baseball as much as I had practiced, and I did some spring training games. This was going to be different. And it was also, the booth was very high up. It was up on the roof, and I didn't see as well as I had seen at the spring training games, or even the games I practiced at our stadium, the previous September. Um, so it was hard. I was just afraid of screwing something up. I mean, that was basically it. I was basically broadcasting in fear of embarrassing myself, and it was that way for the first few games.
How long did it take you to kind of adjust yourself to major leagues and baseball on the radio?
Well, the major leagues came faster than I thought because the players were very welcoming. I was about the same age as they were back then. I was 27 years old. And most of the guys on our team were late 20s, early 30s. And they befriended me, and they would take me wherever they went on the road. If they were going to a bar after a game, I went with them. If they were going out to dinner on a night off, they would take me with them. That made that part of the transition really easy. But doing baseball, it took a while. The pacing in baseball is really hard. Being able to sound relaxed until the right moments. For someone who was a hockey announcer, where there's a shot on goal, an average of every 40 seconds, where there might be a goal, it was a very difficult adjustment, and it took me a few years before I really felt like my broadcast sounded the way a baseball broadcast should sound, uh, because it just had too much intensity in it. Just had a hard time relaxing, and that's a problem for a lot of young announcers who do other sports. Probably the best example is Joe Davis, the Dodgers announcer who took over for Vin Scully. When Joe got started, he sent me a lot of tapes, and he was doing basketball and football and baseball at the time. And his baseball sounded too much like his basketball and football. Baseball needs to be conversational, and it wasn't. And I would emphasize to him, and he's an incredibly gifted announcer. He's incredible. And he was so good already at basketball and football, but he just didn't have the relaxed style that you needed for baseball. And, it seemed like every 6 months he'd send me a tape, and I'd say, "Well, you're doing better, but, listen to this. You were just too intense here. This is the third inning. You're too excited here. You need to learn to lay back, And now he's as good as anybody now, and he's doing lots of national games. But when he had a little trouble making that adjustment, it made me realize that it wasn't that unusual for me to have such a hard time, making the transition from a fast-paced sport to baseball.
I don't know if I've ever heard critique of somebody being too intense, but generally it's you need to up the intensity. But you know what? I think in baseball that is it's a very interesting point that you can kind of, there are people who have problems bringing it back a little bit and kind of sounding more like Vin Scully, where they're relaxed and couldn't care less what happened. Not that they don't care, but that they're just relaxed. It's a day at the ballpark, and I think that's kind of overlooked these days.
And he's the guy we all pattern ourselves after. He's the god of what we do. If you asked all 60 major league radio announcers who's the greatest ever to do this, I guarantee you all 60 would say Vin Scully. Is there any other field, any other profession in the world where you would get such unanimity as to who's the best guitar player? Who's the best lead singer? I don't know. Who's the best president? Who's the best heart surgeon? It would be unanimous. You might get 60 different answers for who's the second best, but Vin Scully never raised his voice. He always sounded relaxed, even when it was dramatic, and he conveyed the intensity of the moment, but he was still relaxed, through 22 no-hitters, or whatever it is. It was remarkable. And it's like we're always asking ourselves, what would Vin do? What would Vin do? And, he once explained it to me, and he explained it to every other announcer who asked him, how do you do this? And he would say, I think of this job as if I'm sitting at the kitchen table and I'm talking to someone across the table over a cup of coffee, and I'm telling them a story. And he said, and that's why I don't want a color man butting in. I want to tell the story. I don't want to hear anybody else's opinion while I'm telling the story. And that's why he never worked with a color man. He refused to work with a color man, even till the day he retired. Now, the business has changed, obviously, during the time that he worked, but still, the theory is the same. The audience should be that comfortable with you that they feel like they're sitting there having a cup of coffee with you. It's not like that in basketball. It's not like that in football, but it's like that in baseball, where the ball's in play for 15 minutes in a 3-hour game. The rest of the time is you just talking to the people.
You are the first Ford C. Frick Award winner that we have had on the podcast. This will probably be the last question before I get you out of here. What was that whole experience like between finding out you won, going to the Hall of Fame weekend, everybody who reached out to you, I'm sure. What was that whole experience like for you?
Aiden, it was surreal. When you realize, I grew up listening to Mel Allen and Red Barber. They were the first two guys to win the Ford Frick Award. They were my idols. And then when the New York Mets came in 1962, they had Bob Murphy and Lindsey Nelson, who also went on to win the Ford Frick Award. Those are the four guys I grew up listening to. To me, like, they should be on a separate wall from everybody else with Vin Scully. You put those five guys somewhere else, and then all the rest of us should have like a secondary broadcast wing. But it was surreal to go to the Hall of Fame and see my picture on the wall next to those guys, and Jack Buck and Harry Carey and Ernie Harwell, and all the greats who I idolized, some of whom mentored me when I started, in my career. Hall of Fame weekend, as an inductee or an honoree, you get to stay at the Otesaga Hotel. Nobody stays at the hotel that weekend except for the Hall of Famers, their immediate families, and some major A-list celebrities. Billy Crystal, Bob Costas, Tom Brokaw. Those are the guys I saw like in the elevator, just going to my room. Or I went out to my maid's cart, and Ernie Banks is taking towels off the maid's cart, and Reggie Jackson is at the Coke machine. It was like I was in some dream, like I had sneaked into some private club and gotten away with it. And I kept waiting for somebody to tap me on the shoulder and say, all right, get out of here. You don't belong here. And then making a speech, which is being nationally televised, and there's a camera, 2 feet from your face, with 50 Hall of Famers sitting behind you. And Gaylord Perry, who had played for the Rangers and, who I knew since 1980, kind of gently heckling me, during the course of the thing. And some other guy telling me before it started saying, you better not go too long or we're going to start throwing stuff. No, these are the guys who were sitting behind me. Sandy Koufax, my number one sports idol, is sitting 15 feet away from me as I'm making this speech. I was never more nervous in my life than when I made that speech. And the feeling of relief when I got done with that without having screwed anything up was just incredible. But the whole weekend, and everybody told me, who had been through it, said, try and savor it, try and enjoy every moment because it'll be gone before you know it. And they were right. As much as I tried, it was gone before I knew it. It was over just in a flash.
All right, final three questions that I get everybody out on before we let you go. Who is a broadcaster that you've always wanted to meet, dead or alive?
Oh, probably Bob Murphy. He was one of the Mets announcers when I was growing up, and I never got to meet him. I also didn't get to meet Red Barber. So those would be the two. I did meet Mel Allen. I met Lindsey Nelson. But those two guys who I grew up listening to, I never got to meet. Also, I should point out, because he's still on the air, and I'm such a huge fan, Cousin Brucey, Bruce Morrow, was the top rock and roll disc jockey in New York when I was growing up. And I listened to him every night on WABC New York. And he's still on the air on Sirius XM, on 60s, in his 80s. And I've written to him, I've emailed back with him back and forth to let him know how grateful I am, for inspiring me. But I'd love to sit down and, have lunch with him someday. Maybe after COVID-19, I'll actually be able to make it happen.
Favorite stadium, or in your case, arena that you've ever gotten to broadcast from?
Tiger Stadium. It's where I got to do my first game, and it's where the broadcast booth is the closest to home plate of any place I've ever worked. We could actually hear conversations at home plate. Doing a game from there was just a different experience from any place else. I loved it.
Yeah, I'm not sure that'll happen anywhere else, especially today.
Not anymore.
With what you said. They were moving you all the way up, all these new stadiums. Broadcasters are the lowest priority. But last question that everybody gets asked, what advice do you have to kids like myself that want to get into the industry?
Well, I'm specifically going to address play-by-play because it's such a specialized skill.
Right.
And my advice is do it. It doesn't matter if anybody's listening. Now you can do it. You can make recordings on your phone. You don't even need a machine. Turn down the sound on TV and make believe you're the play-by-play announcer. Go to a high school game. Make believe you're a play-by-play announcer. You need phrases. And this is the key thing before you can start doing it. There's a million ways of saying a ground ball to short. Here's a ground ball to short. Here's a high hopper to short. Here's a one-hop smash to short. Here's a slow roller to short. Write them down. As you listen to a baseball game, write down the phrases that the announcer uses. I have lists of hundreds of phrases. And then as you do these make-believe broadcasts, plug in the phrases. And eventually they'll be on the tip of your tongue. I still write down phrases. As I'm going to a game, I'm listening to a game usually. And if I hear an announcer use a phrase that I'm not using, I used to scribble it down on a note. Now I just dictate it into my phone. Even if it's something like the way an announcer comes out of a commercial. Ernie Harwell, maybe once a game, used to say, "Here comes the fifth inning, and here comes Al Kaline to bat for the Tigers." It's just a different way of coming out of a commercial. Or he would say, Mark Fidrich getting ready to deal him in to the 6, 7, and 8 batters in the order. It's a different way of saying things. The more different ways you have of saying something, the more interesting your broadcast is. You're not constantly repeating the same phrases. You have to write the phrases down as you hear them so that you can eventually use them. I would write them in the margin of my scorebook. I still do when I hear a phrase like that. I heard a guy during spring training, I don't remember who it was, refer to a pitcher, and he said, he pumps, twists, and throws. That's a phrase I hadn't been using to describe a delivery. Usually, you say he kicks and fires, or he comes to the plate, or he lets it fly, or here's the pitch. The more different ways you have of saying that, the more interesting it is. So write the phrases down, no matter what sport it is. I learned to do hockey, and this is how you learn. Hull to Makita. Hull feeds Makita. Hull flips to Makita. Hull passes to Makita. Hull backhands to Makita. Hull off the glass to Makita. Hull ahead to Makita. Hull drops for Makita. You have to have all those things on the tip of your tongue to master the play-by-play. And once you have that, then you can start working on your style. Then you can really start working on how you're going to use your personality and all the rest of it. But the actual mechanics of play-by-play, it's all about phraseology. And you can learn that at any age. You can start doing that, as soon as you realize you're interested in doing that, you can start listening to announcers, writing down phrases, doing make-believe broadcasts, and plugging them in.
Eric, if people want to find you on social media, where can they do that?
Twitter, it's at Nadel ER, Nadel Air. Instagram, it's Nadel Eric 16. And anybody can message me on that, or just if you tweet me, I'll usually follow you so we can direct message. And that's the easiest way.
Thank you so much for doing this. Really appreciate it.
Sure thing. It was a lot of fun. You came really well prepared. Nice job, Aiden.
Appreciate it.